Chapter 28 of Harry D. or Making It Out. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Harry D. or Making It Out by Francis J. Finn. Section 23, in which Tom Playfair surprises us. "Tom," I exclaimed, when I had recovered from the surprise which this view of the case gave me, "do you really think that the money was taken by someone else after I had caused my uncle's death?" "More than that. I think, otherwise I don't see how everything squares, that the person who stole the money saw you kill your uncle, that person was in the hall when your nurse came out to meet you, and that person stole away while your nurse was examining your uncle's body." "Tom!" exclaimed Percy, "you'd make an excellent detective." "I hope to make something better," said Tom gravely, "and that brings me to the very subject I intended talking about when we started. This murder business threw it clear out of my head. You've both heard me speak of James Aldean. Pretty often, too. Oh, you should have known him. He was more of an angel than a boy. He was too gentle to live, in fact. Well, before he died, he told me a great many things about himself. He had offered up his life for my recovery, a life, too, he had intended to consecrate to God. James died the very morning I made my first communion, and as I knelt over his body, I promised God that with his blessing I'd take James Aldean's place." "And you have taken it, Tom," put in Percy fervently. "You've taken the place of any possible boy." "Am I never to be permitted to soliloquize?" said Tom, quoting from the Mikado. "Evidently you don't understand what I meant by my promise. James intended to give his life to God by working for God. Since the death of James, I've prayed and prayed every day that I might be deemed worthy to take his place. And last Christmas, as I was praying before the tabernacle, I got a distinct call, as I thought, to follow Christ. Boys, this summer I'm going to join Keenan." I caught Tom's hand and shook it cordially, and was warmly congratulating him when we were both silenced by Percy's strange manner of receiving this news. For Percy, instead of joining me in congratulating our dear friend, of whom we were both so proud, had put his hands before his eyes. "Surely you're not sorry, Percy," I exclaimed, "that Tom is choosing the more perfect life?" "Of course he's not," whispered Tom. "He's too saintly for any such view as that." "Sorry!" exclaimed Percy, taking down his hands from his tearful eyes and catching Tom's hands. "Of course you're not," said Tom, gazing earnestly into Percy's face. "But there's something or other troubling you." "There is," answered Percy. "Up to this present year, it had been my darling wish to take the course you're going to take, Tom. But this year it's all changed. Oh, if you only could know how I've suffered. Tom and Harry, pray for me. I need your prayers very much." I do not think that even Tom had ever before heard Percy complain, and now there flashed upon me for the first time one of the awful mysteries of life. Here we were, three boys, on the most familiar footing with one another. I had thought that I knew my two friends thoroughly, and yet for years the one idea of Tom, the mainspring of all his actions, had been to take the place of a departed friend. And Percy, the gentle, the good, he, the prefect of the sodality, whose days had been made up of noble thoughts, he had been suffering silently. I saw between his words the desolations and temptations which God so often sends upon those who are dearest to him. And in that one moment of insight, I remembered how often during the course of the year Percy had been closeted with his confessor. Yes, this saintly young man had gone on treading the wine-press of doubt and difficulty alone, and in this solemn moment had shown us that for all his happy, lovable ways, he had tasted the bitterness of temptation and trial. Truly, we myriad mortals live alone. "Boys, let's change this subject," said Tom, after a few moments of silence. "These are things to think about. They are songs without words. Harry, I doubt whether it'll be worth your while to examine your uncle's house till your lawyers have ascertained a few little facts." I looked at Tom inquiringly. "To begin with, who took the $50,000? That's a great point. Besides the advantage of getting the money back, the thief will be able, perhaps, to tell you where you got that knife, and give you some details about the way in which you dispatched your uncle. Your lawyer should collect data to account for all the servants in the house, their whereabouts, their way of life. If any of them took the money, the way they have since lived will make it clear. A servant with $50,000. "Oh, Tom," exclaimed Percy, "is it quite certain that there were $50,000 stolen?" "That's a fact. Caggett said so. But was he lying? It's certain there was some money taken, but it's certain that Mr. D always kept a large sum in his room. But $50,000, now we begin to think about it, is putting it rather high." "Perhaps," said I, "it was even a larger sum. Whose footsteps were they? How about Caggett?" "Hardly Caggett's," said Tom. "If we assume for the sake of argument that he stole the money, we must also assume as extremely probable that he saw you kill your uncle. Now it strikes me that Caggett, in that case, unless he's a genius in cunning, would be the last man to accuse you of the murder. And yet he was the very one who did. Again, Caggett was the man who made the biggest fuss about the stolen money. I think, Harry, that there's more to be found out yet. It's a problem, and I've no doubt that before very long you'll succeed in making it out." End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of Harry D., or Making It Out. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Erin Stone. Harry D., or Making It Out, by Francis J. Fenn. Chapter 29, in which Mr. Lang obtains further data concerning the missing money and Tom bids us farewell. That very night I dispatched 2 long letters, one to my father, the other to Mr. Lang, our lawyer, giving them a full account of the interview between Mrs. Dorn and myself, and asking Mr. Lang to study up the records of the servants who were in my uncle's house at the time of my visit. I insisted particularly on his finding out, if possible, whether my uncle actually had $50,000 in his possession. The following day I wrote again to my father, who, during my minority, had charge of the property and moneys accruing to me, and submitted a plan for putting out a certain sum of money in Mrs. Dorn's favor and for giving her children an education. My father's letter came very promptly. He assented to all that I had proposed, and sent a bank check to Mrs. Dorn on his own account. But it was some weeks before I heard from Mr. Lang. His letter contained news of importance. "Dear Sir, have traced up Caggett's record. He became a coachman in St. Louis, spent little, then a car driver, which position he retained for a year, when he was discharged for drunkenness. Got another position as a carriage driver, and spent all his money on liquor. The last year and a half he has had odd jobs off and on, but nothing steady. Has become very seedy, tramps occasionally. One of my clerks managed to meet him, treated him several times. He got this much out of him, that your uncle deposited his money in the bank every 3 weeks. I think out of this we can trace up the exact amount in his possession that night. If you have anything further to communicate in the matter of Caggett, let me know at once. Yours respectfully, Walter Lang. P.S. If your father has no objections, I will now put an expert at examining your uncle's books and papers. Your uncle seems to have been a methodical man, and I think will have no difficulty in tracing up all the money he took in subsequent to his last visit to the bank. I shall write Mr. D at once for permission. On the very last day of school I received the following. Dear Sir, after an examination of 5 days, expert reports that your uncle had at least $43,570 in his room on the night of December 23rd, 1800. It was nearly 3 weeks since his last deposit. The detectives who took the affair in hand first seemed to have taken everything for granted. It now transpires that 3 men, James Nagle, a stockbroker, Howard Wilmot, a farmer, and Cyrus Smith, a wholesale grocer, were each aware that your uncle had a large sum of money about him. Nagle, on December 23rd, accompanied by Cyrus Smith, paid your uncle $20,000 on account in a stock transaction. Wilmot, who was in the library at the time, waiting for a receipt for $6,000, paid for a piece of farmland, tells me that your uncle casually remarked that he'd keep all the money 3 days longer. In this house? Exclaimed Nagle. That's risky. Whereupon Mr. D gave a growl. It'll be riskier for the man who comes near me. I sleep light, gentlemen, and besides the money under my pillow, there's a knife on the chair beside my bed. Besides, the house is locked pretty tight. While the presence of the dagger on your uncle's chair accounts for your using it, the fact that these 2 men, I exclude the farmer, knew that your uncle had money under his pillow makes it necessary for me to study up their record. The stockbroker will give me most difficulty. That kind of business is so queer. I have already looked up the case of the cook and the housemaid. They have not taken the money. There remains to be investigated, then, the cases of the stockbroker, wholesale grocer, and coachman. The latter 2 I can dispose of in 2 weeks, but for the first I shall need at least 2 months. Yours respectfully, Walter Lang. It was midsummer when his next communication reached me at our lake in Wisconsin. Harry Quip and I were engaged in a wrestling contest when Tom, who was dressed in a traveling suit, came out with a letter. Mr. Harry D? Cried Tom. Harry did not enjoy the pleasure of throwing me just then, for I broke away at once, hastily took the letter from Tom, and broke open the envelope. I ran my eyes down the lines. Listen, boys. Dear Sir, coachman and grocer are okay. It now only remains to trace up the stockbroker. If he be innocent, things are about as dark as they were before. Yours, Walter Lang. The detective is wrong there, said Tom quickly. If your broker and servants and your grocer are all innocent, it follows, Harry, that you not only killed your uncle, but also stole over $43,000 from yourself. So you're wrestling, are you? Continued Tom. I've just weighed myself, 145 pounds. You see, I want to know how much I change in the novitiate. I'm 5 feet 7 and 1/2 inches high, and, if I can believe my looking-glass, the best-looking fellow in the crowd. Take a walk, said Harry. I suppose you think you can throw the whole crowd of us. That's what, said Tom. Come on, catch as catch can, said Harry. I'm in my best clothes, said Tom apologetically, while taking off his coat, but I'm willing to ruin the whole suit rather than stand that. The next moment he and Harry were pulling each other about in the approved style. The contest was brief. If you had 6 shoulders instead of 2, Tom remarked over Harry, I'd make every one of 'em touch. Tom arose, gazing ruefully at his cuffs. They'll think I'm a tramp when I arrive home tomorrow to bid 'em all good-bye. Come on, try me, said Percy, and I'll fix you up so that they'll think you're an exiled prince. Et tu, Brute? Said Tom, and flew at Percy. The struggle began forthwith. Presto! Tom went down, but sprang up like a bit of India rubber, and the spinning and swelling of muscles and quick changes of position were resumed. Percy came to the ground next, but was up on the instant. Of the 2, Tom was the stronger, but Percy the more supple. After 7 or 8 minutes, both were glad to call the contest a draw. There they stood, 2 panting, blushing young men, looking, one would think, as though their whole lives were bound up in athletics. Yet these 2 friends were about to part, each under the noblest of aspirations. Even as they were wrestling, the carriage which was to take Tom to the depot was being drawn out from the coach-house. Percy now took off Tom's hat, which Tom had just picked up and put on, and producing a pocket-comb, proceeded to give Tom's hair a presentable appearance. In the midst of these operations a happy thought struck me. Tom, I exclaimed, If I ever recover that money, which you stole yourself, interrupted Tom, I'll put out an interest, and if you should need it for any particular purpose, just let me know. Tom thought for a few moments. I'll tell you an idea I've had for years, he then said. What we want just now is a good Catholic magazine for boys and girls. Instead of having Catholic writers growl at the books boys read, we must get them to write something that they will read instead. American boys don't care for the translated French stories, and I don't blame them. They want stories about themselves, and that's why they go to Oliver Optic and Harry Castleman. Instead of running these writers down, our writers ought to go to work and give us the American Catholic boy. He is the best boy in the world. In 10 years or so, who knows, but we might use that money to bring out just such stories. One good Catholic story will do more than a dozen volumes of snarling against books that boys ought not to read. It is better to fight for the good than to rail at the ill, said Percy, employing one of his favorite quotations. Precisely. But as I'm going to take a vow of poverty, it wouldn't be just the thing for me to count upon having a big sum in the bank at my disposition. Percy is just the boy to take such an enterprise in hand, along with you, Harry. Tom, you've given me my vocation, cried Percy, his face illuminated with a smile I shall never forget. It has come upon me like a flash. Oh, you've no idea how I've prayed and prayed for light. My confessor told me not to think of taking the religious state till my mind could clear. It has not cleared till now. But now I think that God wants me for just such a work. I have plenty of money, and, if my father has no objections, I shall invest $15,000 or $20,000 and let it accumulate till I'm ready to start your magazine, Tom. I'm with you, Percy, I cried. No matter whether that money is recovered or not, I'll put in $20,000 out of my uncle's estate. This was no boy talk. Percy's father was a man of immense wealth. As for myself, my uncle had left me a fortune of some $300,000. How quickly the time passed as we discussed, in all the glow of roseate youthful hope, the prospects for our magazine. But alas, the hour of parting came. I still see our dear Tom standing upon the rear platform as the train moved away, waving his hand and smiling till a curve shuts off from our view one of the noblest, bravest boys. We were all on the verge of tears. Harry Quip changed our emotions in this peculiar way. Taking an ancient slipper from beneath his coat, he threw it after the train and burst into sobs. The slipper was too much for us. We all relaxed into a smile, tear-stained it may be, yet a smile. Quip was indignant. "You're a set of fools," he sputtered. "I wouldn't give Tom Playfair for a car-load of fellows like you." End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of Harry D, or Making It Out. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Harry D, or Making It Out, by Francis J. Finn. Chapter 30, in which I have the doubtful pleasure of renewing Mr. James Cagget's acquaintance. For Percy and myself, our year in the rhetoric class did not run smoothly. We had an excellent teacher, it is true, and started in with a will. But early in November, Percy was called home owing to the serious sickness of his mother, and I, too, was called away later. We missed him sorely in the classroom and in the yard. Frank Burdock, who to his great joy had been promoted to the senior division, was inconsolable. Quip, Ruthers, White, Richards, and myself formed the remnants of the Ciceronians. Harry took Tom's place as leader, and he performed his part well. Yet, when we met together, we missed our two friends and felt that the old order was changing, yielding place to new. Late in November, I received a letter from Mr. Lang, which bears closely upon the strange adventures I have yet to relate. Let me put it before the reader in full. Dear Sir, After long and careful study, am certain that stockbroker had nothing to do with making away with that $43,000-odd. We must conclude then that you yourself secreted the money before or after stabbing your uncle. It is the only possible solution as far as I can see. My idea then is that all of said money is on the premises. If there, it can be found. However, before taking any steps in the matter, I would like to have a personal interview with you, for I wish to make you thoroughly satisfied that I have used all human prudence in studying up this very complicated case. We'll call on you at St. Maur's if you wish, but as am busy with other cases, would prefer it could you contrive to come here. Yours sincerely, Lang. After reading this letter, I fell into a brown study. As matters now seemed to look, the facts in the case were all phenomenal. First of all, it was improbable that I should kill my uncle with one blow of a dagger, even in waking hours, and still in my sleep I had struck him with the nicest precision. Again, it was improbable that I should have examined his bed and made away with and secreted all his money. Were I to tell a stranger these details, he would laugh at me or brand me as a falsifier. There were other difficulties. Did Mrs. Dorn really hear an adult's footfall in addition to my light patter, or was it a part of her dream? The evidence gathered by the detective would seem to negative the former. But despite all evidence, these doubts still lingered in my mind. The desire to solve the mystery of my uncle's death had now become the leading thought of my life. There was no risk I would not encounter, no danger I would not dare to arrive at the truth. If necessary, I was resolved to give not only my money, but also to venture my life for the unraveling of this tangle. I should state here that for some months past, the entire management of the case had been entrusted to me by my father, who, confined to the house by an attack of bronchitis, had been compelled to put aside all business affairs. My good father had the utmost confidence in me. Of course, I consulted him on every step, and I must say that he rarely, if ever, gave me any advice. "Think it out for yourself, Harry," he would say. "You have shown your obedience by asking my advice, and I am grateful. Now, show your self-reliance by choosing your own course. That boy is blessed whose father can teach him docility and independence in one lesson." As I read and reread this letter, I remembered the few words which Tom had whispered me as we shook hands at the depot. "Harry, old boy, you're not out of the woods yet with regard to this muddle. The time will come when you'll feel it your duty to yourself to go to that house again, and who knows but the second visit will bring out more than our first. I can't be with you next time, but you can get a better companion. Take Percy Wynne. Percy's as gentle as a girl, but he's as bold as a lion. He's not afraid of anything in this world or the next except sin. As for ghosts, why, Percy would as soon talk to a ghost as to a peanut seller. You can rely on Percy. It struck me now that Tom's prediction was coming true, and I determined, if I could bring it about, that in case I should make another visit to the haunted house, Percy should be my companion. 2 days after the receipt of this letter, I was closeted for 6 hours with Mr. Lang. His statements were luminous. Not a loophole seemed to be allowed for error. I was staggered, and before leaving him, I was convinced that I had slain my uncle and made away with a large sum of money belonging to myself. I was troubled in mind to return to St. Maur's, and besides, my father was very low. I felt that my place was by his side. As the days went by in the pleasant companionship with my father, the conviction borne in upon me by the data of Mr. Lang softened into doubt. The old difficulties presented themselves. "Father," I said one evening in mid-December, "I'm not satisfied with Mr. Lang's statements." "Don't you believe him?" "Yes, Father. That is, I believe that he believes his own conclusions, but I'm not satisfied." "Well, what do you propose to do?" "I propose to spend another night at Tower Hill Mansion." "Alone?" "No, Father, with Percy Wynne." "When?" "As soon as Percy Wynne can join me, Father. I'll send him a dispatch at once." It was now December 20th, and Percy was in St. Louis. Without delay, I wired him the following message: "Will you accompany me to the Tower Hill Mansion at earliest convenience?" The prompt reply came: "Certainly, we can start on the morning of December 24th. Percy Wynne." The following morning, I received this letter: "My dear Harry, my mother is now out of danger, and it will be a great pleasure, my dear friend, for me to clasp your honest hand after so long a separation. I'll be delighted to have your company even for a single night, and even in a haunted house. What's a haunted house, after all? We're in God's hands there, just the same as anywhere else. Isn't God upon the ocean just the same as on the land?" asks the little girl in the poem. "Do what we may, we can't get away from him, nor lose a hair of our heads without his permission. And so, dear friend, we'll spend Christmas together." Were it not for that, I'd wish you a million pleasant things in this letter, but how much better than cold writing will it be to speak to you from my heart and face to face. I have seen Tom. They call him Carissime Playfair. Carissime is short for the vocative Carissime Frater. He is well and oh so happy. He is more of a wag than ever, but when he does stop laughing, which happens seldom, there's such an expression of sanctity upon his features. When he lived with us, much as we thought of him, we were entertaining an angel unawares. He sends you his dearest love. I have just now written him a few lines to let him know where we are to be at midnight of Christmas. He will be at midnight mass, and I've given him strict injunctions to batter the gates of heaven with storms of prayer, all during that midnight mass for our intention. You, my dear Harry, value Tom's prayers as I do. He's an American saint. Well, goodbye, my dear friend. You have no idea with what pleasure I look forward to meeting you. I have examined the timetable and find that I'll reach Sessionsville at 7 a.m. Your train for Tower Hill Mansion leaves at 9, so there'll be no difficulty in my calling at your house and making the connection. Goodbye once more, dear Harry. Yours most affectionately, Percy Wynne. P.S. Am delighted to hear that your father is so much better and that the doctor pronounces him to be on the road to recovery. Give him my sincere regards. Pray for me as I pray for you. P.W. On December 22nd, I was walking homeward toward nightfall when a man came shambling up to me asking for an alms. I was struck for some inexplicable reason with his appearance. Clad in rags, a battered old hat upon his head, a thick brushwood of beard upon his roughened countenance, he was every inch a tramp. His hair, long neglected, was iron gray. But what impressed me most was his rugged, forbidding forehead fixed in gloom and bordered below by heavy, forbidding eyebrows. I gazed at him for a moment while he continued his entreaties. The air of gloominess about him, by a natural transition in my present state of mind, brought back the memories of Tower Hill Mansion. Then, in an instant, it flashed upon me that no less a person was standing before me than my uncle's old butler, Mr. James Caggett. My plans were formed on the instant. Here before me was the very man who, of all men living, was best acquainted with the interior of my uncle's mansion. In case a protracted search were necessary, who could be a more useful assistant? On the other hand, I knew full well that, Of all the places in the world, Tower Hill Mansion would be the last place where Caggett would go of his own free choice. In common with the other servants of that ill-fated mansion, as I had learned from Mr. Lang, he held it was a house of haunted horrors. All the same, I was determined that Caggett should accompany me, if anything short of downright physical force could bring it about. "If I'm not mistaken," I began, "I am talking to an old friend of my family, James Caggett." The bloodshot eyes glanced at me very sharply from under their rugged brows, while the forehead wrinkled into a hideous frown. "Who are you?" he said, with the rasping voice which appeared to have caught the trick from my deceased uncle. "Don't you remember the little boy who came to spend Christmas night with his uncle 6 years ago?" Again he looked at me keenly, and I saw, as the blood deserted his cheeks, that he recognized me. "Yes, I know you." Ha ha ha! What a blood-curdling laugh it was. "I thought you were the murderer once, didn't I? But I meant you no harm. Honestly, I thought you did it in your sleep, but I was glad when I heard that she-devil had done it and not you." My anger at his allusion to Mrs. Dorn almost got the better of me, but I held myself in check. "So you're in need of help," I said. "I haven't had a square meal in 3 days, sir. Things have gone awful hard for me. An honest man can't make a living in these hard times. Yes, sir, I've been obliged to beg. Couldn't you get me something to do, sir?" "Yes," I answered quickly. "You come to my father's house at 8 sharp on the morning of December the 24th, and I'll give you a job that will pay you well, and if you satisfy me, I'll try to help you along." "I'll be there, sir. Will it be ready money?" "You'll get a good sum from me on Christmas morning. Here are $2.50 for your present needs. I'd give you more, only I count on making it up when we meet again." "Thank you, sir." How eagerly he clutched the money. "You may be sure that I'll call on the morning of December 24th. His rasping voice still rasped in my ears as I made my way home, and into the disordered dreams of that night floated this gloomy-browed, hideous tramp, moving about in all the fantastic shapes born of unpleasant memories. End of Chapter 30.
Chapter 31 of Harry D., or Making It Out. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Harry D., or Making It Out, by Francis J. Finn. Section 31, in which Mr. Caggett allows himself to be persuaded to spend a night in my uncle's house. If my dreams were unpleasant on the night of the 22nd, they were positively frightful during the succeeding night. My uncle came and went in various loathsomeness of shape. Caggett came and went in all the bloated proportions of unhealthy dreamland. Both, by way of variety, invaded my slumbers together, and their harsh, rasping voices cut my agonized dream self like a knife. These hideous apparitions were succeeded by moments of wakefulness, at which intervals I half repented of my morrow's expedition, and devoutly wished that my uncle and his money had never come within the sphere of my life. At 3 in the morning I arose in disgust, took a cold shower bath, and composed myself to read. After an early breakfast I threw my things into my valise, and was taxing my memory to find whether anything had escaped me, when I heard a sharp ring at the door-bell. Being on the tiptoe of expectation, I hastened to the door myself, and opened it upon a boy, who delivered me the following telegram: "Train delayed 6 hours. Can't make it so as to meet you at Sessionsville. Will see what I can do. Percy Wynne." My heart sank on reading these lines. The disappointment was keen, and again I was tempted to abandon the extravagant project. What? Spend the night of all nights in that house of all houses, with that man of all men, Caggett? The fear and loathing with which the very thought of this fellow filled me is unspeakable. To the reader it may appear childish, and indeed in a certain way it was childish. There are impressions made on us in early days which many years efface not. In the presence of Caggett I was still, so to speak, the small, nervous, sickly boy not yet in his teens. Yet why should I fear him now? I was strong, healthy, well developed, his superior in intellectual training, nearly his equal in strength. Thus I reasoned, but feeling and memory were not to be carried by syllogisms. I was afraid of Caggett, that was clear. I was resolved that he should be my companion, that too was certain. But I could not bring myself to think of spending a single night alone with him. Accordingly, within 3 minutes of receiving the telegram, I sent a note to Mr. Lang, telling him I needed him at once, and unfolding the circumstances that made me request his attendance. I sent this note by a special messenger, and after an interval which, short as it was, seemed an age to me, I received this answer. Dear Sir, I regret exceedingly that business of most pressing moment, and to which I have pledged myself, will not allow me to accompany you on your visit to your uncle's house. Am very sorry indeed, for am very interested in the case. The best thing I can do, the only thing, is to send you the only available man I can command, Mr. John Nugent. He is a good man, very acute, but young, inexperienced, and as yet much wanting in physical bravery. Hope he will do. It will be a good novitiate for him, in our line of life, to spend a night in what is popularly supposed to be a haunted house. With regrets, I am yours sincerely, Lang. P.S. Nugent has given me trouble. Doesn't want to go at all. But I put the screws on him. He'll be at your house within a few minutes of this letter. L. This missive did not raise my already depressed spirits. Everything seemed to be going awry, even the weather, which had grown ugly. A few minutes before 8, a young gentleman with nondescript clothes, straw-colored hair and mustache, and a washed-out complexion presented himself to me as Mr. John Nugent. I was struck with his retreating chin, weak mouth, and general air of irresolution. "I'm afraid," I said, as I shook his hand, "that I'm taking you upon a very uncongenial task." "Oh, dear, no, not at all. You don't know how delighted I am." And he smiled as men smile when they're lost for facial expression. "My friend," I thought, as I gazed into the face of the very weak man, "if unnecessary and injudicious lying be a passport to success in your profession, you'll stand at the top in a disgracefully brief time." Further reflections were cut short by the appearance of Mr. Caggett, every inch a tramp still, but a tramp brushed up as to his shreds and patches for a special occasion. "Good morning, Caggett." And as I spoke I felt grateful for the encouraging presence of even the insignificant Mr. Nugent. "You're on time for a splendid job. I'll need your services today and perhaps tomorrow, for which I'll give you $25. "I'm your man," said Caggett promptly. "What do you want me to do?" "I'll begin right off. I want to examine my uncle's house." What a living horror his face became as he took in these words. "The haunted house?" he gasped. "Pshaw, that's talk," I answered. "No, it isn't," he protested. "You'll never come out alive." "Nonsense! I spent a night there already, and I liked it so much that I'm not afraid to go again." "But I am, and I'll not go." "Lord, To think of staying there alone, where my old boss was murdered. But you'll not be alone, I urged. This gentleman and myself will keep you company. The horror was still on his face as he repeated, I'll not go. Caggett, I need you. I want to search all the rooms for a large sum of money. You know the house better than any one alive. I'll make it worth your while to go. You'll get $50. Was it the $50 which changed Caggett's purpose? I thought so at the time. Perhaps the sequel will supply the reader with another and a stronger motive. At any rate, after due pause and consideration, Caggett asked, Will you give me 1 pint of brandy today, another tonight, and another tomorrow? Yes, I answered after reflection. But mind, if you get drunk, you get no pay. He laughed a laugh, which was as the swinging of multitudinous hinges, whereat the law clerk changed color and tugged nervously at his mustache. You needn't fear that I'll get drunk on that allowance. Well, I agree to go, but remember, I'm not to be alone for a single second during this night. That you may rely upon, I said, if you follow instructions. Thus it came to pass that Caggett, Nugent, and myself, a most ill-assorted trio, took the 9 o'clock train for Tower Hill Mansion, arrived there on a gloomy evening, and established ourselves in my uncle's house, to pass a night so full of strange occurrences, so remarkable in its turn of events, that I shall give it the benefit of at least one chapter to itself. End of chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of Harry D. or Making It Out. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Harry D. or Making It Out by Francis J. Finn. Chapter 32, in which I get a letter and make a discovery. Now, I began, when we had taken a general survey of the whole interior, I want you both to understand what I'm after. I have reason to think that my uncle died with over $40,000 by his side. That money, I have also reason to think, is still in the house. Probably it is in one of the 3 rooms. I thought, interrupted Caggett, that Mrs. Rayner ran away with all the money. So did others, was my answer, but later events have changed that opinion. As I was saying, I have reason to think that if this money is about at all, it is probably in my uncle's library, or in his bedroom, or in the room where I slept that night. We'll begin by making a thorough search of the library. Then we'll go on either to the room where I slept that night or to my uncle's bedchamber, according to the time it takes us to complete our search in the library. I don't understand, said Caggett, with his frown and rasp in the superlative. Well, you know enough for the present. We entered the library and began the search. At first, I was amused by the nervous, terrified glances of my 2 companions. Nugent was constantly looking over his shoulder while his fingers were flying up and twitching his mustache every minute. Caggett was less nervous in his movements, but by no means less frightened. The peculiar look of horror to which I have already referred was his characteristic expression. His hand was cold and clammy, his face pale and drawn. All this, I repeat, was amusing at first, but the amusement was short-lived. Nothing is more contagious than fear, and very soon I discovered that I too was yielding to fright. Unconsciously, I began to take an occasional look over my shoulder. In short, we were a trio of cowards. Frightened as I was, however, I was determined to brave it out. In comparison with my companions, I was a hero. Despite our condition, we effected a thorough search of the library. Not a case, not a shelf, scarcely a book remained unexamined. Then we sounded the flooring and the walls. Here, my weak friend, the clerk, showed that he was not utterly an ignoramus. So interested did he become in tapping the walls and partitions that he lost sight of his terror and actually put fresh spirit into me. The library was a large room, and I discovered when we finished its examination that it wanted but 5 minutes to 11. "Now, gentlemen," I said, "we shall go to my uncle's room and examine it in the same manner." But here the wretched Caggett objected. "No, no," he exclaimed, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Not that room. Take your own first. We can go to your uncle's in the morning." My mind is made up. My uncle's first. "No, or at least wait here till midnight passes." There was a great fear upon his features. "Come on," I said sternly, catching up the lamp. "I'll not go," he growled. "Very well," I said, "then I'm going to lock you up here alone without light. And besides, oh, I'll go. I wouldn't be alone here for all the money in the world." As he spoke, he took a mouthful of brandy. How closely these two men clung to me as we ascended the stairs together, so closely that I could feel that they were trembling and hear, as I thought, their heartbeats. As we were midway between the first and second floors, the woodwork upon which we trod gave a dismal creak. Caggett jumped with fright, and had it not been for the support of my free hand, would have fallen down the stairs. Soon we were hard at it, examining my uncle's room. Nugent was now a trifle brave. There was something of the detective in him, for he was really earnest in the work of finding out every nook and cranny of the apartment. Within 15 minutes we had explored my uncle's wardrobe, his table, and his desk. Then Nugent took the lead. Caggett was in a state of terror, which he kept within limits by frequent applications to the bottle of brandy. After we had examined the flooring, he threw himself into a chair and addressed the detective. "It's no use. If I were you, I would sit down. We'll put in our work in the other room. Hadn't we better try the other room now?" he inquired, turning to me. Neither Nugent nor myself paid him the least attention. We were both busy sounding the walls. I had come within a few feet of my uncle's bed when Caggett jumped to his feet and ran over toward me. "For God's sake," he cried, "let us leave the house now. Tomorrow will be the time. Tomorrow." "Sit down, you coward," I said sternly. He complied, yielding rather to his own terror than to my words, and I continued tapping the wall. "Have you ever made a close examination of the bedding?" asked Nugent, turning to me. "Tom Playfair and myself took a look at it when we were here," I replied, "but we didn't spend much time at it." "There's nothing there," growled Caggett. "I made it up myself before I left this horrible house." Nugent, taking no notice of the remark, proceeded to throw coverings, pillowcase, and mattress upon the floor. Scarcely had he done so when Caggett rose and advanced to his side. "Let that bed alone," he growled. Caggett was an awful spectacle. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face was quivering with fear and rage. Nugent was daunted by the horrid sight. He stepped back and stood gazing spellbound upon this wretched figure. "Here, Nugent," I exclaimed, "you try your hand at this wainscoting. I'll examine the bed myself." Caggett closed his hands tightly and made a few steps toward me, brandishing his fists as he advanced. "Stand still," I cried. "Nugent, I call upon you to look at this man." Nugent, who had put himself beside me, lifted his head, and the two of us eyed the would-be aggressor in silence. Caggett quailed at our stare. Muttering a curse, he returned to the chair and buried his face in his hands. Suddenly, an involuntary exclamation from my lips brought the detective to my side. "What's this?" I exclaimed, pointing to a letter which was pinned to the underside of a bed-slat. The clerk, without answering, pulled away the pin, and the letter fell to the floor. There was a muffled sound from Caggett. "Why," I cried as I picked it up, "just look at this address." Nugent bent over and read, Master Harry D. Present. Get the lamp, Nugent, I said. This letter looks very old, and who knows but it may have come from my uncle. I tore open the envelope, and as the clerk held the lamp, I read with wonder and dismay, such as no words can express. December 24th, 18 blank. Nephew Harry, tonight at 12 o'clock, I commit suicide. If you should enter this, my room, tomorrow, you will find me dead with my own knife in my heart. James D. Good God, I cried. Am I awake or dreaming? Nugent took the note from my palsied hand and read it with eagerness. What do you think of it? I asked. He handed me back the note, glancing as he did so towards Caggett, and again the terror of that sight seemed to penetrate Nugent's inmost being. Look, he gasped. Well might he be frightened. Seated beside the table, Caggett was the personification of horror. His facial muscles were twitching madly. His eyes were fixed upon us with a glassy stare. His mouth was open, and he appeared to be struggling for breath. It appeared to me at once that the wretched man had been taken by a fit. Placing the lamp on the table, just at his elbow, I hastily took another pint of brandy from my valise and filled him a small glass. More, he gasped as he drank it down at a single draught. I filled him another. His terror moderated sensibly. Caggett, I said, when I was satisfied that he was calm enough to converse, look at this letter from my uncle. He endeavored to hold the paper, but it fluttered from his hands to the floor. Picking it up, I read it aloud. Do you understand this, Caggett? There was a fearful play of muscles about his throat and a few deep gurgles as of a man choking to death before he succeeded in forcing out the words. Yes, and it's true. What? I cried. All these years you have known that my uncle made away with himself, and you have allowed an innocent woman to be hunted? But how did you come to know of my uncle's suicide? The same struggling and play of his throat ensued before he labored forth the words. More brandy. I administered him another glass. That night, he began with an effort, I was working in the cellar till after 12 o'clock. When I came upstairs, I knocked at his room. He paused to pass his hand over his brow. There was no answer, and I entered, and then I saw your uncle lying in the bed, dead, killed by his own knife. On the chair beside him was that letter addressed to you. I read it. I took the letter and hid it in that place where you found it. Why? Why? I don't know. That's a lie. Tell me the reason. I had overheard what your nurse had said to your uncle, and I wanted to throw his death on her. I was not satisfied with this explanation, the more so as his halting way of delivering it gave me reason to suspect that he was holding something back. Now, Caggett, why should you want to throw the suspicion on Mrs. Rayner? Because I thought people might think I did it. Was that your only reason? Caggett seemed to have fallen into a stupor. Don't give that man any more brandy, whispered the frightened young man in my ear. If you do, there's every chance that we'll have a madman on our hands. I was a fool to come here. With which Nugent, taking another shuddering look at the hideous tramp, turned his back to us and resumed his examination of the wainscoting. Caggett, I repeated, catching him by the shoulder and shaking him. Was there any other reason? He opened his lips to reply, but though his lips moved, there came no sound. Do you understand, Caggett? I intended to steal his money, he answered with an effort. I glanced at the detective. Tom Playfair was right, I muttered. Mrs. Dorn did hear real footfalls besides my own, and here is the thief. No, said Caggett. When I got here, the money was already stolen. I looked at him earnestly. He seemed to be speaking the truth. Mrs. Rayner stole it, he added. "You wretched villain," I broke forth, "if you ever speak of Mrs. Rayner in that way again—" "Look, look!" Nugent suddenly broke in. "Here's something!" I ran to his side. Kneeling beside the bed, which he had moved out from the wall, he was gazing into an opening in the partition, evidently much frightened at the discovery he had made. The opening revealed a recess about 1 foot square. "How did you find this?" I asked. I touched something or other. It must have been a spring, and part of the wainscot rolled back." As Nugent seemed utterly unable to proceed further, I gently shoved him aside. He fell sprawling as though I had struck him with a club. Putting my hand into the secret recess, I drew out a heavy wooden box, open at the top. Bringing it nearer to the lamp, I perceived almost at a glance that I was holding a fortune in my hands. Banknotes of all values, gold and silver, every species of money. The missing treasure was found. But who had placed it in this unknown hiding place? It must have been my uncle. Could it be possible that he had deliberately secreted the large sum before committing suicide? This train of thought brought me back to Caggett. Why had he thrown the awful suspicion of murder on Mrs. Dorn? Ah, it was true that he himself had wished to make away with the money. I turned to address him. As I was about to speak, the clock in the hall, which I had taken care to set early in the evening, broke into a peculiar whirring noise, at which sound Caggett gave a nervous start and, in moving his arm, struck the shade of the student lamp. The shade moved several inches. It was connected with the wick, and in turning lowered it so that we were once again in a dim, ghostly light. Caggett did not know that he was the cause of the darkness, and as the clock struck the first stroke of the hour of midnight, he sprang to his feet with a low, horrible gasp and fell upon his knees, facing toward my uncle's bed. Nugent, whose fears had been mounting with every moment since the discovery of the letter and the treasure, gave a wild cry, rushed to the door, and clattered down the stairs. End of chapter 32.
Chapter 33 of Harry D, or Making It Out. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Charlotte Rose. Harry D, or Making It Out by Francis J. Finn. Chapter 33, in which Caggett makes a startling disclosure, and I pass for the great crisis of my life. There beside the faint light of the lowered lamp, in presence of a kneeling man writhing with agony, I stood horror-stricken. It was a terrible moment, terrible in its present features, more terrible still in what it promised. Caggett was looking with a strained gaze not at the bed, but at something on a line with it. His hands were alternately clasped, then thrown out from his body as though he were waving off some hideous vision. Inarticulate gasps and groans were laboring from his throat. Gasps and groans beast-like in their sound, with the added human agony of a man beside himself with terror. I did not know it at the time, but I am now certain that, as Nugent had predicted, he was crazed with drink. I would have come to his help, but I was no longer master of myself, and for what seemed a long span of time I stood motionless, gazing with awe upon this uncanny sight. At last Caggett burst into speech. "Oh, Mr. D, Mr. D, you made me do it! Go away! For God's sake, don't look on me that way!" And he waved his hands madly. I looked in the direction of the bed, almost expecting to see the luminous spectre of my uncle. But I saw nothing. "It was all your own doing, Mr. D. You drove me to it. Didn't you tear up the will which made me your heir? I was listening, and I knew you had over $40,000 with you. I couldn't help it. I didn't mean to kill you." Imagine my state of mind when I heard these words. It was a murder after all, and I was alone with the murderer. "Before God, I didn't mean it. I stole up here and tried to get your money without waking you, but you opened your eyes and recognized me. Then I seized your knife and, oh, keep off! Keep off!" He gave a wild cry and fell foaming at the mouth. With an effort I freed myself from the spell which had bound me, and turning on the full light of the lamp I hastened to czandra. There he lay, the embodiment of remorse and terror, his mouth still covered with foam, his eyes glassed in horror, every feature hideous beyond all human features I had ever seen. There he lay, my uncle's murderer. I could scarcely bring myself to touch this inanimate clot of crime. How my soul sickened as I put my arms about this dreadful man and placed him on my uncle's bed. I returned to the table and seated myself. Serious as I feared was the condition of that man of blood, I could not bring myself to touch his loathsome body again. Even his stertorous breathing filled me with disgust, and yet I realized that I would be obliged to spend several hours, at the very least, in his company. Nor, as the time passed on, did my feelings of loathing lessen. To add to my disquietude, I found gradually that I was fascinated by that still figure on the bed. I could not withdraw my eyes from his face, though with every second that face seemed to take on additional repulsiveness. At length, unable to endure the situation longer, I brought a chair to the table and set about counting my treasure trove. I spent quite a time in separating the gold, silver, and the bills of various denominations. But presently I found that I was in no frame of mind to carry out my intention. Then I began pacing up and down the room, keeping my face turned from the bed, endeavoring to put czandra out of my mind, and forcing my thoughts into lovelier channels. I thought of Percy. How I longed for the presence of that dear friend. I thought of Tom, our little Jesuit. By this time, Tom must have heard midnight mass, and it comforted me to think that his prayers were with me and helping me even now. Now! That one word brought back the ugly present realities, brought back czandra and all the hideous train of thought I had endeavored to put aside. Yes, I was at length sure of the murderer, sure, too, of the money so long lost. But how about my uncle's note announcing his intention of committing suicide? How, too, did it happen that the money had been secreted? Certainly my uncle, as I knew from the data furnished me by Lang, had not been in the habit of hiding his money. Had he actually intended to commit suicide, only to be killed by his villainous servant before he could carry out his purpose? If so, why then had he concealed the money? But I scouted the thought that my uncle had contemplated making away with himself. I remembered my last interview with him. I remembered his kind words, and I felt convinced that, if he had written the note directed to me, it had been written previous to our interview in his bedroom. And his intention had certainly been changed. For several hours did I ponder and consider, endeavoring vainly to piece these contradictory circumstances into a consistent whole. At length, wearied and troubled, I paused in my walk, and turned my face toward the open window which looked out upon the east. The first faint grey streaks of dawn were upon the horizon. I stood for some moments gazing upon this joyous promise of daylight. But I found presently that Caget's figure was again asserting its horrible fascination. And once more I turned my face to the wall, and, seating myself, I forced my thoughts to dwell upon the sweetest memories of Christmas. I believe that all boys take pleasure in thinking of Bethlehem and the angels' songs. It is a series of beautiful tableaux for young as well as old. At all events, I became very interested in these tender memories, and I actually made what Catholics call a meditation. My imagination grew vivid, and I almost saw the dear infant, the sweet mother, almost saw that multitude of the heavenly host praising and glorifying God. Almost saw the great light which casts such holy fear upon the shepherds. Almost heard that heavenly chorus singing Gloria in excelsis Deo, when suddenly, why I do not know, unless it be that I have a guardian angel, the vision faded, and by some impulse, which I do not attempt to account for, I turned my head sharply. I was not one moment too soon. As I turned, I noticed in the very act that it was sunrise, and the sun, bright and cheerful, was peeping over the eastern hills. This I noticed in a flash. But the fact of sunrise had no interest for me at that moment. The bed was empty! Caget, on tiptoe, he had advanced halfway across the room. His evil eyes were fixed upon me in a way there was no mistaking. In his right hand he grasped an open knife. The knife almost escaped my attention, but the eyes! I read in them that I was not to leave the room alive. You may be sure I didn't stop to stare. For as I took in the situation, I bounded to my feet, while Caget, throwing aside his attempt at stealthiness, sprang at me with a fierce cry like the cry of a savage beast in its most savage moment. Fear lent me agility. In a trice I had placed the table between myself and him. Oh, how I reproached myself that I had neglected to bring a pistol! I was face to face with men stronger than myself and more accustomed, I had good reason for thinking, to deeds of violence. He was armed with a knife. I was unprotected. My heart sank within me, for I realized that the chances were in his favor. I thought of making a dash for the door, but it was evident that before I could turn the knob his knife would be in my back. Again I thought of picking up a chair and fighting him with that weapon. But this would involve a hand-to-hand conflict, a thing I was resolved to avoid as long as possible. For my great hope was in getting assistance from without. That cowardly law clerk might, after all, have heart enough in his chicken breast to return, once it was broad daylight. His return was my strongest hope. I resolved, therefore, by putting the table between Caget and myself, to keep him at a distance as long as possible. What a tragic chase it was! With his eyes fixed steadily upon mine, Caget played me as an angler would play a fish. With the coming of day his bravery had returned, and it was the fierce bravery of desperation. His terror had disappeared as completely as the shades of night. The deadly purpose which animated him could be read in his every feature, and most legibly in the rigid determination of his compressed lips and heavy lower jaw. Our actions, were it not for our facial expressions, might have impressed an observer with the idea that we were playing a game of tag. Round and round we moved about the table, anon with guarded step, anon with sudden dashes. His every movement, slow or rapid, his every pause was my guide. As he moved, I moved. As he paused, I paused. How long this grim game went on, I cannot say. It seemed at times to be of interminable length. It seemed at times to have gone on but for a few seconds. Whatever the length of time, we were soon breathing heavily. I could feel my heart beating in a way that under ordinary circumstances would have alarmed me. But placed as I was too excited to be sensible of fear. It was in one of these pauses, when I stood stock still, separated by the length of the table from my adversary, that there came upon the stillness, thus far broken only by our heavy breathing, a crashing noise. And with it the room grew suddenly quite dark. For the moment Caget was disconcerted. He turned suddenly in the direction whence the noise came, and I took the advantage of that one moment to seize the lamp from the table, and send it with all my force at his head. The noise that had alarmed Caget so much was occasioned by the falling of the window curtain, which, owing doubtless to our violent motions, had broken from its fastening above the window. As I had been facing in that direction, I had taken in the circumstance without being obliged to turn my eyes from my enemy. But quick as I had been in hurling the lamp at Caget, I was the least bit late. As he ducked his head, the lamp went crashing against the wall, within a few inches of the curtained window, and burst into 1,000 fragments. With a sharp hiss, Caget made a dash round the table. I was almost too late in recovering myself. And indeed, as I darted away, the blade of his knife touched my coat. The throwing of the lamp had given me a new idea. Upon the table there still remained the box, heavy with its store of coins. In passing around the table I seized it, determined to await my opportunity to throw it at his head. But here I made a fatal mistake. The box was heavy and cumbrous. Once in my hands, I discovered that I had to rid myself of it, or be caught in a few moments. I hesitated between replacing it or throwing it at Caget. It was probably the hesitation of half a second, but my decision, as the sequel will show, was unfortunate. I threw it at Caget's head. At once Caget ducked beneath the table. And while the papers and notes went fluttering about the room, and with 1,000 jingles the silver and gold fell and rolled in all directions upon the carpetless floor, mingling confusedly with the fragments of the glass, and while I stood motionless, waiting for Caget's head to reappear, I suddenly felt a strong clasp upon my left ankle. Caget had crawled under the table to my side. On the instant I screamed out, "Help! Help!" And with all my energy I broke away. I succeeded in tearing myself from his grasp, but at what cost? I lost my balance, fell headlong, and though I sprang to my feet without waste of a moment, there was a sharp, stinging pain in my left leg just above the ankle, where Caget's knife had penetrated. At once my plans were changed. Delay on my part would now be dangerous, for the blood was streaming from the wound. And I grimly foresaw that with loss of blood I would presently become weak and dizzy. And then all would be over. The issue must be at once, and therefore, as I gained my feet, I turned and sprang upon Caget, catching him above the wrist of his right hand, so as to prevent his stabbing me, and bearing him, with the force of my spring and the unexpectedness of the onset, heavily to the floor. Then there resulted a fearful struggle. He was under me, glaring at me with the same murderous look, and despite all my efforts prodding me here and there above the shoulders with his knife. I put both hands to his wrist and held it firmly, while the blood came trickling down my arm and fell upon his upturned face. And very soon what little confidence I had was gone, for I felt my strength leaving me. Strange noises, did they come from within or without, broke like the beating of drums upon my ears. The firmness of my grasp relaxed, and as a feeling of intense lassitude came over my frame, the full horror of my situation flashed upon me. I endeavored to pray, and in the act heard, as I fancied, quick footfalls without. Perhaps help was nigh. The thought seemed to revive my strength, and indeed I needed it all. Catching Kagget's hand, which had just escaped me, I arrested what might have been a fatal stroke. The struggle was renewed, and as it went on I was certain that someone was coming. I felt now that my grasp upon him was losing its firmness. And then the door burst open, and a figure, so dim had my eyes become that I failed to make out who or what it was, bounded into the room. I saw an arm strike out once, twice, and then I slipped into unconsciousness. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of Harry D. or Making It Out. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Harry D. or Making It Out by Francis J. Finn. Chapter 34, in which Percy Wynne throws additional light upon Kagget's narrative and puts an end to the mystery. "Hello, Harry. Merry Christmas." Percy was bending over me with a scared face. "Thank God, thank God," I whispered. "Is it you, Percy, that saved me? I never counted on looking upon your dear face again." "Yes, Harry, without boasting, I can say that I saved your life. Kagget had you down when I struck out at him. I attempted to rise from the bed on which I was lying, but found I could scarcely lift my head. So stiff and sore was I from cuts, bruises, and loss of blood. I gave a gasp of pain and sank back upon the pillow." "Poor boy," said Percy. "You mustn't try to move again. I've spent over an hour bandaging you, and if you move my bandages will come loose. Be patient for a while. I've sent for a doctor for you and a constable for Kagget." "Where is he?" I inquired, trying to take a full view of the room, and noticing in the effort that the bed was stripped of blanket, coverlet, and sheets. "He's in the room next this, the wretch. But you wouldn't know him. I've bundled him up in blankets and sheets. They were the nearest things to ropes I could get, till he couldn't move hand or limb. He's such an awful sight, though, that I thought it would be pleasanter for you to miss seeing him." "But, Percy, you haven't told me how you came to save me." "It's a long story, Harry. I went on the principle, better late than never, and took the evening train after paying your father a visit. I got to the depot beyond about 3/4 of an hour before sunrise, and I found standing there, solitary and stupid, an insignificant-looking little man, who seemed to be in a state bordering on insanity." "Oh, Mr. Nugent," I put in. "Yes, I got his name out of him at about the time that an ordinary dentist would have extracted all his double teeth. I plied him hard with questions, and I'm afraid I shook him a little roughly, poor fellow, before I could get the least inkling of the way things had been going on here. He gave me the idea that Kagget was dead because of the ghost, and that you were dying. I didn't wait for anything more, but set off for the house at a dead run." 6 miles? Did you run all the way?" "Pretty much. When I got in sight, though, I was content to walk. I came on, getting nearer and nearer, when, as I was within 300 or 400 feet of the house, I heard a cry. "Help! Help!" "You heard me, Percy." "So I thought. And then you should have seen me run. I beat my record that time and came bounding into the house and up the stairs. I could hear an awful rolling and tumbling going on, and guided by the sound, I made for this room. Caggett was just about to stab you. The 2 blows I gave him were cruel. He dropped over to one side like a log." "But Percy—" "There now, lie still. You shouldn't get excited. I've lots more to tell you, you see. I know the whole story. Caggett told me everything." "How?" I exclaimed incredulously. "Oh, he didn't want to, but I persuaded him. At first, when he came to and found himself tied up in sheets and bedclothes, he wouldn't talk at all. But I saw that he was nervous, and I thought that by taking him on his weak point, I might get all the news out of him. I took it for granted, of course, that he was the murderer." "How did you work on his nerves, Percy?" "Oh, it was quite simple. I cocked a pistol and put the muzzle against his ear, and said, 'Mr. Caggett, will you be obliging enough to answer a few questions?' And Mr. Caggett became very obliging all at once, for he professed himself willing and ready to answer any and all questions I might put to him. Then I took the pistol away from his ear and began patching you up, poor boy, while I put him through a long examination. Would you like to hear the first and complete edition? He told me all that you know, and I'm sure you're puzzled still." "Where did you get the pistol?" "Right here in this room. I found it in Caggett's pocket, and it was loaded, too. I could see that by the way Caggett acted when I pressed it against his ear. By the way, Mr. Caggett, I believe, will never be hanged for the murder. What drinking has left undone in ruining his health, the terror and the wounds and what not of this night have accomplished. The wretched man will probably never leave his bed again." "Tell me what he told you, Percy." "Well, be quiet, you're weak. You know how once upon a time your uncle destroyed a will in your presence which favored Caggett, and read one in your favor? Your nurse claimed $50,000 from your uncle, said she'd have it, and made some remarks about your uncle not living long. Caggett overheard every word. He had a trick of using a keyhole. He became very angry and made up his mind to get something out of your uncle. He knew that Mr. D had a large sum of money on his person, $43,000, which he would place under his pillow at night, and he determined to get that money and fly the country. He did not make up his mind to kill your uncle. That was an afterthought. At 12 o'clock he stole up to Mr. D's room, advanced on tiptoe to his side, and tried to get the money. But here began all the trouble. There was no money under Mr. D's pillow. Caggett examined very cautiously and without disturbing the sleeper. He knew your uncle generally slept with it under his pillow, but on this particular night of all nights there wasn't a trace of the money. Was the dagger there? I broke in. Yes, it was quite convenient to your uncle's hand. Where was the money? In the place you found it, answered Percy. You understand, don't you? It's plain that your uncle anticipated some danger or other that night, and hid those things away. Ah, I exclaimed, he suspected that Caggett might attempt to rob him. Precisely. Knowing Caggett pretty well, it might have occurred to him that his servant had been eavesdropping and might attempt to visit him that very night. Anyhow, whatever was the reason of his suspicions, he was justified in the event. Well, to go on, Caggett began a systematic search of the room. Of course, he didn't find the money, for till a few hours ago he didn't even know anything of that secret recess. Finally, he approached the bed again and was about to renew his search when your uncle suddenly opened his eyes, gave a gasp, and whispered, "Who's there?" And as he spoke, he caught Caggett's arm. Caggett, with a jerk, released himself, and as your uncle gave a cry for help, he caught him by the throat, choked him into silence, and grasping the dagger, which had slipped from your uncle's hand, plunged it into his breast. Would you believe it, Harry? That villain told me this as though he was speaking of the state of the weather. Having assured himself that your uncle was dead, the wretch walked over to the table, and turning up the light, your uncle, it seems, always slept with the light burning low, he wrote a note in imitation of James D.'s handwriting, announcing, "Ah," I gasped, "there's more light." You saw the note already, Harry. Caggett told me. But to return to our story, Caggett had just blotted and sealed this, when he heard a footstep without. Scarcely knowing what he was doing, and certainly not knowing why, Caggett hastened over to the bed and pinned the letter where you found it. Then he brought out a pistol and, cocking it, waited. The steps drew nearer and nearer. Caggett waited motionless. Then, Harry, you appeared, a little boy in your nightshirt. You stopped for a moment on the threshold, and, as Caggett says, looked straight at him. That was very near the last of you, old boy. Caggett picked up a very heavy walking stick and advanced with the intention of braining you. But instead of drawing back, you walked right in. He remembered that he had heard you were a sleepwalker and lowered his arm. You kept on your course, walked past him, and stopped at your uncle's bed. You passed your hands over your uncle's face and breast, and even touched the knife. In leaning against the bed, Caggett saw that you had dabbed your nightshirt with blood. This suggested a new plan to him. You were a somnambulist. It would appear that you in your sleep had murdered your uncle. Resolving to destroy the letter he had forged next day, Caggett stole on his tiptoes out of the room, and made his way hastily to his own sleeping room, which was halfway down the hall. "Ah!" I exclaimed. "His were the footsteps that my nurse heard." "So I think, too." Well, he had not been in his room half a minute when he heard someone else coming along the corridor. He put a chair beside his door. There was no light in his room, and looked through the transom. He saw your nurse, who was very agitated, carrying a lamp in her hand, and then he saw the meeting between you and her. He watched your nurse's movements until she left the house, and then he felt sure that no suspicion would fall on him. Did he give up the search for the money? No, indeed. After Mrs. Dorn left the house, he spent a part of the night in searching your uncle's room. Even when all else had deserted the place, he continued his search for several days. On the last day he was severely frightened in some unaccountable way, and left precipitately, vowing never to come near the house again. He didn't keep his vow, I observed. No, the fact was, when you announced your intention to him of making a search for the money, he remembered how in a hurry of leaving he had neglected to destroy the forged letter. Then it occurred to him that if the money were found, he was entitled to it. Mr. Caggett is a poor logician. These considerations, added to your promise of money, overcame his fear. He counted on destroying that note, to begin with, and in the next place, if the money was found, he was determined to make off with it. Have you seen the treasure, Percy? Yes, after removing Mr. Caggett, I gathered up the scattered contents of that box. I never handled so much money in my life. It took me a long time to get it together, for I had to keep my eyes on you and be on the lookout for some passer-by to get assistance. When I did get it all together, I brought the box by your side, Harry, and counted out the money, and watched you closely for ever so long a time. Did you know how much you've fallen heir to? How much? 45,000 and some odd dollars. Isn't that a Christmas gift? I exclaimed. Within a week, Percy, those $45,000 will be put in a bank, and there they'll grow to more in preparation for that great boys and girls magazine that is to be. Percy, allow me to return your first greeting. I wish you a happy Christmas. And as we shook each other's hand, we heard voices without, and people entering, and we knew that the mystery of Tower Hill Mansion was solved. that the problem had been made out, and that the shadow which had wrapped my life thus far had been lifted forever. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Harry D., or Making It Out. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. Harry D., or Making It Out, by Francis J. Finn. Chapter 35, in which Harry D. has some difficulty in bringing his story to a close. It is August 1st, 1 year and 8 months since the adventures related in the last chapters. Arrayed in all the glory of graduating costumes, several very fine young gentlemen are seated in the parlor of the Jesuit novitiate. The reader knows them all. He knows Harry Quip, grinning from under the first hint of a mustache. He knows Percy Wynne, who has taken the gold medal for excellence in the various branches of the philosophy class. He knows Frank Burdock, the only non-graduate present, now quite tall, and with a face eminently intellectual. He knows Will Ruthers and Joe White, and as there comes a quick patter down the stairs without, and there enters, clothed in cassock and biretta, a handsome, dark young man with bright twinkling eyes and merry face. He knows Mr. Playfair, S.J., who has taken his 3 vows and is now a religious. What a chorus of babble and laughter arises as we shake our dear friend's hand and congratulate him on his happiness. For it was only yesterday that Tom, impelled with the desire of serving God, and trusting in his infinite sweetness and mercy, vowed in presence of the most sacred Virgin Mary and the whole heavenly court, poverty, chastity, and obedience. "It's the happiest day of my life, almost," said Tom. "I should say, Mr. Playfair. And if it were not for yesterday, I think I could say it is the happiest. Well, Harry, it's consoling to think that Caggett, after all, died penitent. The poor fellow had a long year's purgatory in the hospital, and his sickness and suffering proved to be the greatest blessing of his life. And how's the new magazine?" "Strong in spee," I answered. "The money is safely invested, Tom, and it can wait better than Percy and I. We feel like making a start at once, but we're determined to be prudent. I hope to be a member of the staff, Tom. I mean, Mr. Playfair," said Quip, feeling for the down upon his upper lip. "You see, I'm thinking of taking to journalism. That is, if I take to anything." "And I," said Joe White, "intend to study law. Will Ruthers, who looks so mild and gentle, is going to be a sawbones," added Quip grimly. "What are you thinking of, Frank?" asked Mr. Playfair. "My present vocation," answered Frank, "is to graduate. Then I think I'll marry." "After which," put in Quip, "he'll look about to see how he can support a wife." "I've got stock in a building association," said Frank seriously. "These graduates are great fellows, Mr. Playfair," said Percy. "They're starting in at once, all except Harry D. and myself." "Don't believe Percy," said I. "He's doing the work of 3 even now. He's the best friend of poor boys in the world. There's not a newsboy or a bootblack in Cincinnati who doesn't know and love him. He's studying up the lives and conditions of that class, and he intends giving much attention to bettering the poor fellows, and he's done ever so much good among them already, though he's only had a chance of making their acquaintance in the last 2 months." I did not add what was the fact, that Percy was looked upon by many a homeless lad as a saint. They loved him, but their reverence kept pace with their love. Percy had not forgotten his adventure with the dying tramp. His great heart was filled with love and compassion for God's chosen ones, for the poor and the outcast. He was determined to help them on, beginning with the little ones, on the theory that all reforms are best effected from below up. "Very soon," said Percy, changing the subject, "Harry and I shall take a trip to Europe." "What then, Percy?" asked Mr. Playfair. "Oh, we'll settle down and take a special course of literature and philosophy. You see, we intend preparing along for the great magazine that is to be. Harry D. proposes, in addition, to study finances. We've settled it between us that he's to be business manager and I the editor. We have concluded not to make any start till we're 30 years old or so, and in the meantime there's a big sum of money gathering interest. By the way, where's Mr. Keenan?" "He's out on a walk," said Tom, "but I think he'll be back soon. But there's another friend of yours here." "Who?" came the chorus. "Guess," answered Mr. Playfair. Before we could make answer, the door opened and, "Oh, Mr. Middleton!" There stood our beloved teacher and prefect, beaming upon us with his old-time smile. He had changed but little, though his face wore markedly that expression which may be noticed in those whose thoughts have been constantly turned upon sacred things. While we were still welcoming him, Tom called out, "Boys, that's not Mr. Middleton. He's Father Middleton. He was ordained on July 31st. There was a solemn silence. Each of us knelt, and Father Middleton, passing from one to another, gave us his priestly benediction. What a delightful time of it we had that morning. Old memories, pleasant and fragrant they were, came back again. We fought our battles o'er, and talked and laughed with an abandon which sent time flying on the swiftest and lightest of wings. Harry Quip presently mystified us not a little. He called Father Middleton aside, and went off with him, we knew not whither. When he returned after half an hour, he made up for lost time. He talked and joked and laughed, till Frank Burdock brought him to a stand by saying, "Harry, have you been drinking?" "No," said Harry, "it's worse." "Let's hear your confession, then," said Mr. Playfair. "I just made it to Mr. Middleton, Father Middleton, a general confession of my whole life." Harry was now quite serious. So were we. We saw that something more was to come. "And besides, I've had a talk with the novice master." "Oh, Harry Quip!" exclaimed Percy. "He's of the same opinion as Father Middleton, and in a few days I'm going to join Donald in the Baltimore Seminary." "Well, Harry Quip," exclaimed Percy, grasping his hand warmly, "you always were a lucky fellow. Here you go and get one of the sublimest of calls, and leave Frank and Harry and Joe and me out in the cold." Percy was smiling as he spoke, but there was sadness in both smile and voice. "Well," said Harry, "you fellows deserve to be left out in the cold. When Tom went away, you didn't throw an old slipper after him. I did, and now I'm thrown after the slipper. Perhaps the reader may think I'm exaggerating, but it is a fact that before dinner, Joe, Percy, Frank, and myself contrived to hold a secret interview with our saintly Father Middleton. But none of us came from it with an abounding joy that Harry had carried away. Still, all of us, I trust, were more at peace with ourselves and with God after our interview. We did not, like Harry, find a great vocation, but we received such advice as Father Middleton, who knew us so well, judged best for our interests. When I returned from my conference with Father Middleton, I found that another young religious had joined our little reunion. "So this is Harry D.," he exclaimed, with the most engaging of smiles, as he grasped my hand warmly. "I know you very well, Harry, though probably you have never even heard of me." "Yes, he has, carissime," put in Mr. Playfair. "All my St. Maurice chums know you pretty well. What a pity we're not allowed to have pillow fights here." "What?" I burst out. "Arthur Vane?" "The same," laughed Arthur. "I'm the youngest novice in the house. He came to pay me a visit several months ago," said Mr. Playfair, "and fell in love with this place. We could hardly get him out. He came back in 2 weeks to stay." "And now I'm happy," said Arthur, "and I look upon the night I met Mr. Playfair as the night of my life." During the hour that preceded dinner, Percy and Arthur became warm friends. They struck me as being remarkably similar in their tastes and manners. In the afternoon, Tom rearranged the blue clippers. Our genial friend Mr. Keenan played his old position, and pressing into our service Frank Burdock and Arthur Vane, we put out a full 9, which Tom, as of old, led to victory. The young religious, pitted against us, played very well, but, we played better. The time came but too quickly for our departure. "Boys," said Mr. Playfair, as we were about to leave the parlor, "before you go, suppose we visit the master of the house." Somewhat mystified, we followed Tom. He led us into the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. Frank, Harry, Joe, and myself kneeled upon the bench farthest back in the chapel. Tom and Percy were in front of us. Impressed with the occasion, I was praying with more than usual fervor, when I felt a light touch upon my arm. I lifted my head and saw Frank. "Look," he said reverently, "isn't it beautiful?" And he pointed to the kneeling figures of Tom and Percy. The evening sun was shining upon them, mingling the glory of earth with the heavenly glory that seemed to play about their faces. To look at them as they then appeared was as powerful an object lesson in prayer as this earth can give. Yes, before them, concealed by the tabernacle, was the one sweet secret to their lives. It was the incarnation that had made Tom our Tom and Percy our Percy. We were on the eve of separating and taking different walks in life. But different as were these walks, they were all to conduct us, we trusted, to the same goal, to an everlasting union with Him, before whom we were now bowed in fervent adoration. The end. End of chapter 35. End of Harry D. or Making It Out by Francis J. Finn.